How will bankruptcy impact my employment? That's a question that people should be asking. It depends on your employment. It depends on if you have a high-level security clearance. It depends on if you work with financial information, if you work with money, if you work with trade secrets potentially. But generally, according to the Society for Human Resource Management, 60% of employers do look at credit reports when making hiring decisions or promotional decisions, as far as promoting somebody from within. So as far as what are those employers concerned with, well, I've got it right here. Let's see what they are most concerned with. The number one thing that they're looking for in a credit report is outstanding judgments. They do not want outstanding judgments. And I don't blame them. If I was an employer, I wouldn't want any employees with judgments either, because dealing with garnishment as an employer is really a pain in the neck. Because if you don't do it properly, you could be held liable to the judgment creditor. It depends on your jurisdiction. I'm not going to get too in depth on that. But just so you know, employers don't like judgments because they don't want to deal with garnishments. In fact, I was teaching a class for some CPAs for their continuing education, and I asked them, I said, what do you think about garnishments? And they all laughed. They said, we love garnishments because we get to charge the employers, we get to charge them more because it takes us longer to process their payroll. So CPAs maybe like the garnishments because it gives them more opportunity to earn income. Employers, not so much. Also, if I hire you and I'm your employer and you're not such a good employee and I fire you, well, at that point in time, you might say, you might go to an employment attorney and say, well, Patrick fired me from my job, but I don't think he said I was a bad employee, but I think it's more because he didn't like the fact that I was being garnished. I can't legally fire you for being garnished, and you could then turn around and sue me potentially, depending on your jurisdiction. So anyway, the reality is some people might think that bankruptcy was number one, but it's not. Outstanding judgments are number one, and bankruptcy would get rid of outstanding judgments, so that's very interesting. Number two was debts and collection, because a debt in collection today is a judgment tomorrow, potentially. So if I don't have judgments today, but I have collections, well, ultimately, depending on what the creditor wants to do, depending on the amounts, timeframes, whatever, they may sue me, get a judgment, and then ultimately, now I've got a judgment, which is the number one thing they don't want to see. So it makes sense that collections would be number two. Number three on the list was bankruptcy. So that's number three. So number one was judgments, number two were collections, which I see on credit reports all the time, and then number three was bankruptcy. Number four was high debt to income ratios. So as far as, okay, based on your income, based on the amount of money you owe, we don't want to see that you owe a bunch of money because we know what you make. We don't know what your spouse makes necessarily, but are you more likely to steal? Are you more likely to embezzle? Yeah, there is a duty owed to protect the organization. And I don't know you. If I'm an employer that you're applying for a job at, I'm assuming that you're going to put the best thing that you possibly can on your resume. I'm not necessarily going to believe everything that you put on your resume. I'm going to verify some things, but and I'm assuming that your referrals that you've provided, the references, I'm assuming that this is probably your best friend, your cousin, and maybe, hopefully not your mother or father, but probably somebody who likes you. I don't think you're going to necessarily give me a list of 3 people that you don't get along with. So I'm going to assume that all that stuff is going to be the best it possibly can be. When I look at a credit report, I can get a true sense of what somebody's lifestyle is like. If I see a bunch of collections, if I see somebody just doesn't pay their bills on time, I can kind of see how responsible they are, how disciplined they are. And I can see if somebody is really, really disciplined, and I can see if somebody is really lackadaisical. So your credit report really tells you a lot about who you are in terms of how you conduct yourself. Now, granted, it would only be fair to say sometimes things happen with credit that's out of your control. If you get hit by a bus and you're in a coma for 90 days, guess what's going to happen? You're not going to pay your bills. And what's going to happen to your credit is that your credit is going to take a gigantic decline in 90 days. Realistically, you can go from an 800 FICO score down into the 500s, probably high 500s, probably within 90 days if you just stop paying everything across the board. So sometimes it's issues that are out of our control. It's not a lifestyle issue. It's not that I'm not being responsible. It's that, I got hit by a bus. Or, being hit by a bus could be an analogy for a lot of things that can happen in our lives. So sometimes it's out of our control. So my advice would be, anytime you're applying for a job, and they would have to get your signed authorization in order to pull that credit report. They cannot just pull your credit report without your authorization. They have to have signed authorization. So you are going to know if they're going to pull that credit report or not. And if you know that they are, my advice to you is if your credit is less than perfect, if you've got any issues at all on your credit report, then, maybe it's bankruptcy, maybe it's just a collection from the utility company, or maybe you were late on your Macy's card, whatever the case may be. It's better to strike first and to say, guess what? You're going to pull my credit report and you're going to find some things. I would like to provide an explanation on what the circumstances were, why is this on there, why it was out of my control, and most importantly, why it's out of character for me. This is not how it usually is. This is what happened. I lost my job, or I went through a divorce, or I had a medical issue. Some circumstance that happened that disrupted your life, that was, caused this issue. It's not normally how you deal with things. So I think that's a good way to approach it. So definitely, if employers are going to be looking at credit, strike first. Don't let them make assumptions. And I think that's a very good way to approach it, is to say, okay, here's what happened, here's why it was out of my control, and here's why it's not likely to happen again. So as far as employers, the rest of the stuff that they're looking for, then it was tax liens, then it was education debt, medical debt was last, and then other was the remainder. So the reality is employers are looking at things, but bankruptcy is not the number one thing that they're looking for. And in the bankruptcy code, there are some protections against discrimination. You would need to talk to your bankruptcy attorney to see how that would apply to you specifically. And certainly, I would say employment should be a concern, especially if you work if you're in the military, you absolutely should find out how is this going to affect me. And sometimes it's a matter of going to your superiors. I have had clients in the past who work for the federal government who were just terrified that they could never, ever get out from underneath their crushing debt because of what they felt it would do to their security clearance. They went, and I said, well, go talk to your superiors, because are you making an assumption? And if we start making assumptions, that's when life starts to get a little dangerous. And so I said, you're making an assumption that this is going to be a bad thing, but you don't know what the criteria is. Always find out what the criteria is. What is the criteria for the security clearance? Because I got to tell you, if I'm the guy in charge of the military base, and you say I'm thinking about filing for bankruptcy, how is this going to affect my security clearance? If I'm making a rational decision, I would almost rather see somebody finding a cure to the debt than not finding a cure to the debt, and then maybe being more likely to be bribed. If you owe $100,000 in credit card debt and you're under pressure to support a family, and I'm only paying you $60,000 a year, and all of a sudden somebody says, hey, I'll give you $50,000 in cash if you let me come through this secure perimeter, I'm more afraid of that than somebody who doesn't owe any debt. They're not. If you don't have any debt, how are you going to be bribed? I mean, maybe, but think about it from that standpoint. Explanations, investigating criteria. What is the end game to this? What can I do? What should I avoid? Get the answers to those questions.